He was meant to save thousands of lives, but became the laughingstock of the sky. An airplane jammed with machine guns, so heavy it could barely lift off the ground. A project that held high hopes was suddenly canceled without explanation. Why? The answer was not in the blueprints, but in what happened to its brother in the sky. War changed the sky. It no longer belonged to the birds. It became an arena where the fate of millions was decided. The roar of engines replaced the silence, and what flew above the clouds were no longer just airplanes. They were steel fortresses carrying destruction and fear. Huge bombers stretched into the sky in whole flocks, like slow whales in the raging ocean of war. They were meant to reach the target, drop their cargo, and return. But enemy fighters turned their journey into a hunt, where the prey was anyone who lagged behind for even a moment. To protect these giants, the world needed a new type of aircraft, not one that attacked, but one that guarded. Thus, the concept of the escort fighter was born. Machines capable of accompanying the cumbersome bombers all the way to the target and back, repelling enemy attacks. However, creating such a defender proved almost impossible. Theoretically, it looked simple. The plane had to be fast to catch the enemy, maneuverable to evade attacks, and possess long range to travel the entire journey with the bombers and return. But the laws of physics do not allow for compromise. Increasing the range required more fuel, which meant more weight and a loss of speed. Add a powerful engine, and you get excessive fuel consumption. Make the fuselage lighter, and you lose protection and stability. The engineers of the time faced an impossible task, uniting the incompatible. Every major power sought its own recipe for balance between power and maneuverability, between fuel and speed, between armor and freedom of movement. But time did not wait. While blueprints multiplied on designers' desks, planes were already burning in the sky. The Germans were the first to enter this race. Their engineers, confident in the Reich's technical superiority, created two fighters that were supposed to be the backbone of bombing missions. One was heavy, with 2 engines, a large fuel reserve, and impressive armament. The second was light, fast, and nimble. On paper, they seemed like a perfect pair, but the sky quickly put everything in its place. The heavy fighter could fly far, but was unwieldy and vulnerable in close combat. The light one, conversely, easily escaped attacks, but its tanks emptied too quickly, and it was forced to return, leaving the bombers uncovered. Over Britain, this dilemma became a tragedy. German bombers headed for their targets, while their escort melted away in the sky. The heavy machines, incapable of sharp maneuvers, became easy prey for British fighters. Returning to their airfields, German pilots saw empty parking spots on the runways. Too many had not returned, and at the Luftwaffe headquarters, they realized for the first time, the sky does not forgive compromises. Defeat forced them to look for new solutions. In Germany, they tried lengthening wings, adding external tanks, experimenting with twin engines, but everything came down to one thing, either speed or range. It was impossible to have one without losing the other. And while German engineers tried to change physics, their opponents on another continent decided to pursue a completely different path. The Americans, who entered the war later, looked at the situation with cool calculation. They did not strive to create the perfect fighter. Their bet was different, not on the escort, but on the bombers themselves. Generals declared that if every machine was equipped with dozens of machine guns, it could defend itself. Thus, the famous flying fortresses emerged, heavy aircraft that were supposed to fly in the tight groups, creating an impenetrable wall of fire in the air. On paper, it looked brilliant. Dozens of flying machines, each with its own arsenal, covering each other from all sides. An enemy approaching such a formation was supposed to come under a hail from dozens of heavy-caliber machine guns. But reality proved harsher once again. In the skies of Europe, these ideal schemes were shattered by a simple truth. Enemy fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and knew where to strike. Hundreds of bombers did not return from raids, and after only a few months, it became obvious. No wall of fire could save them from a well-organized attack. American commanders faced the same problem as the Germans. A year earlier, their bombers went into battle without protection, and the deeper they advanced into enemy territory, the smaller their chances of returning became. But unlike their opponents, the Americans were not going to retreat. They needed a temporary fix, some kind of solution, until engineers could create a true long-range fighter. This is how the story of one of the strangest and shortest-lived experiments in aviation history began. The attempt to turn an ordinary bomber into a flying arsenal. Engineers decided that if fighters capable of escorting the column were not yet available, then other bombers would take on the role of defenders, without bombs, but with guns. Instead of a bomb bay, they added extra machine guns, armor, and thousands of rounds. They were not supposed to attack targets. Their mission was to protect their comrades. Thus, the idea of the flying gunship was born, and while on paper it seemed like salvation, in reality, it became a symbol of the desperation that reigned in military headquarters. One such project was the XB-41, an experimental variant of a bomber converted into a pure defender. The enemy was not supposed to fear it, the engineers themselves were, because the further the work progressed, the more obvious it became. The more protection you add, the fewer chances you have of getting airborne. But at that moment, no one thought about physics. Crews were dying in the sky, and on the ground, they wanted to believe that a wall of lead was still capable of saving the lives of at least some of them. It was with this hope that the experiment began, which was meant to be a temporary solution, but turned into one of the most controversial decisions in aviation history. By the start of the war, the European sky had become the arena for a new strategy. The Luftwaffe, confident in the strength of its machines, was building a doctrine of air superiority. German engineers proposed two types of fighters that were supposed to be the eyes and shield for the bombers heading to London, Birmingham, and Coventry. The first was the heavy twin-engine Bf-110, an impressive long-range machine with a decent fuel supply and powerful armament. The second was the light and swift Bf-109, a pilot's favorite, almost perfect in duels, but limited in range. Initially, the generals chose the heavy variant. It seemed more reliable. The large fuel reserve allowed it to accompany the bombers all the way, and the powerful weapons inspired confidence. However, in the very first operations, it became clear that in combat, everything was decided not by numbers and specifications, but by seconds and turns. Encountering British Spitfires and Hurricanes, the heavy Bf-110 became a target. Its inertia prevented it from escaping fire, and its large size made it an ideal target. Pilots recounted that opponents literally circled around them, attacking from unexpected directions. The light English machines played with the Germans like cats with sluggish beetles. And while the Bf-110 had a range advantage over their own sky, the British did not worry about fuel. They took off, struck, and landed close to home. The Luftwaffe flew over foreign land, and every minute of the fight consumed the remaining fuel needed for the return. When it became clear that the heavy escorts were not coping, the command attempted to bring the Bf-109 back into action. Their pilots rejoiced. These were fast, razor-sharp machines, but they had another problem: the tanks. To reach British targets, they had to conserve every liter of fuel. The pilots escorted the bombers only part of the way, and then, risking it, turned back, leaving the cumbersome machines to their fate. Moments after their departure, British interceptors appeared in the sky, and the carnage began. German generals looked at the reports from the front and realized that with every week, the air campaign was turning into a disaster. Losses were growing, and the results were negligible. The British were not giving up, and their factories continued to operate. The heavy fighters were too slow, the light ones were too restricted. They had to choose between speed and life, and most often, fuel won. Attempts to improve the situation looked desperate. The Germans experimented with auxiliary tanks, external pods, and even an in-flight refueling system. But all this was just a temporary crutch. The technical dead end was becoming obvious. A versatile machine was needed, capable of escorting bombers over long distances and surviving in combat. Every new sortie showed the sky over Britain is not for those who hesitate. When the enemy survives thanks to maneuver and you lose everything because of fuel, there is a temptation to look for workarounds. This was not only the thinking in Germany. Across the Atlantic, the Americans watched the Luftwaffe's defeats and drew their own conclusions. But instead of copying German mistakes, they decided that escort might not be necessary at all. After all, why have a fighter if the bomber itself can become a weapon? The US bet was revolutionary. The B-17 and B-24, massive flying fortresses with dozens of heavy-caliber machine guns. Generals assured them, Our bombers will protect themselves. Each machine could unleash a stream of lead in all directions, turning the air around it into a deadly barrier. In the right formation, in a box or a group, they were supposed to cover each other with crossfire, like a moving fortress of steel and thunder. The first months of flight seemed successful. The formations looked imposing. Pilots believed in their invincibility, but reality quickly shattered the myth. Encountering experienced German pilots, the Americans realized that the enemy would not play by their rules. Enemy fighters attacked from above and below, waiting for the moment when the bombers' gun positions could not overlap the sector. Assault groups entered in a wedge, passed through the formation, and disappeared, leaving burning planes in their wake. Loss statistics shocked even the most resolute commanders. Entire squadrons did not return home. The bombers, created as a symbol of strength, became a symbol of vulnerability. The Americans, confident in their technology, felt fear before their own invention for the first time. Their fortresses were too slow to escape and too large to hide. Even 10 machine guns could not save them from fighters attacking from different sides. The formation that was supposed to terrify the enemies became an ideal target for coordinated strikes. While the staff in Washington argued over who was to blame, the engineers or the tacticians, airfields in Europe lacked crews. Losses grew so high that missions had to be postponed. Officers understood that without cover, every sortie was a one-way ticket. The American belief in technical superiority was cracked. The illusion of invincibility collapsed under the pressure of reality, and only those who were lucky to return remained in the air. The question was no longer, do we need fighters? Now it was, can we build them before the enemy controls the sky? Desperation breeds the strangest ideas. After numerous failures, American engineers decided to act radically. If there was no fighter capable of covering the bombers, then a defender must be created from the bombers themselves. Thus the concept was born, sounding both insane and brilliant. The flying gunship. The B-24 Liberator, a huge 4-engine bomber, was chosen as the base for the experiment. It was intended not as a carrier of explosives, but as a living shield for its comrades. Everything related to bombs was removed from its cargo bay: release mechanisms, sights, and targeting equipment. The freed space was filled with ammunition boxes and additional armor. Where bombs once lay, there were now boxes with thousands of 50 caliber rounds. The engineers installed new turrets, not one, not two, but a total of 7. A remotely controlled mount with 2 barrels under the nose, an upper turret behind the cockpit, 2 on the sides near the hatches, 2 underneath, and 1 in the tail. A total of 14 machine guns firing in all directions. In the hangar, this plane looked like a cross between a combat vehicle and a metallic monster from a nightmare. Outwardly, the XB-41 was almost indistinguishable from a regular bomber, but upon closer inspection, it struck with its sheer overload. Additional armor, ammunition, turrets, all added thousands of kilograms. The machine became more than 10% heavier, a catastrophic number in aviation. Even pilots accustomed to the massive B-24 confessed to feeling apprehension before the new variant. It was too clumsy, too overloaded, and it seemed as if the structure itself protested against what it was being forced to do. The military, however, saw a chance in this project. Every new machine gun was an argument for survival. If we can't make the plane faster, they reasoned, we'll make it invulnerable. The atmosphere in the design workshops resembled a fever. Blueprints changed every week, engineers argued all night, and workers assembled the prototype, barely keeping up with the changes. No one knew if this behemoth would fly at all, but everyone hoped that it would stop the flow of dying crews. When the XB-41 was first ready, it truly inspired respect. It looked like power incarnate. The long lines of the fuselage, the gleaming turrets, the protruding barrels of the machine guns, like the teeth of a predator. Photographs of the new plane were published in technical journals, and the military smiled reservedly, looking at their own monster. But beneath this confidence lurked doubt. Even the chief engineers whispered among themselves, "Will it hold the air?" The pilots assigned for testing did not hide their skepticism. One of them, looking at the turret diagram, remarked, "It looks like it can shoot down anyone but itself." The laughter that day was nervous, as everyone understood that if the monster did not take off, there would be no time left for a new project. but every bullet added was a kilogram of hope and a kilogram of doom. The first tests began in early 1943. Takeoff was difficult. The XB-41 barely lifted off the runway, and even from the ground, it was visible how the machine wavered, as if unsure if it wanted to be in the sky at all. The pilot felt that the controls had become sticky. The plane did not respond to the rudders, and every attempt at a maneuver was met with a shudder in the fuselage. The center of gravity was so displaced that the slightest gust of wind caused the machine to bank, like a drunken giant. After landing, the first report was frank. "This thing doesn't want to fly." On the pilot's face, there was not irritation, but fear. He understood that a little more, and the monster would simply crash under its own weight. Engineers tried to correct the errors. They rearranged equipment, redistributed the load, added stabilizers, and changed propellers, trying to increase thrust. For several weeks in a row, the XB-41 was disassembled and reassembled, as if they could persuade the metal to become obedient. With each new flight, the situation improved slightly, and at some point, it seemed that success was imminent. Reports became calmer, and the military again spoke of the possibility of mass production. However, behind the scenes, discussions were already underway. Generals, tired of failed experiments, began to doubt whether it was worth investing effort in a project that might simply not arrive in time to change the course of the war. The XB-41 continued to fly, but each flight increasingly resembled a test not of the machine, but of the patience of those who believed in it. The decision came unexpectedly, without loud statements, without scandal, without reports full of technical terms. Just a short order. The XB-41 project is deemed unsuitable for service. Terminate work immediately. The designers did not believe it. The machine had not crashed, had not exploded, had not caused accidents. It simply did not meet expectations. On paper, it sounded dry, but behind these words was the disappointment of hundreds of people who believed they were creating salvation for the pilots. In the hangar, where tools had recently rattled and smelled of burnt metal, a silence hung. Engineers stood around the plane, as if at the grave of a living creature into which they had poured a part of themselves. It was ugly, clumsy, but it had something human, a desire to survive at any cost. Now this plane awaited a different fate. It was not sent to battle or placed in a museum, but transferred to a training center, into the hands of mechanics, so they could learn how to service real bombers on it. All that remained of the combat dream was a training model. Yet, the story did not end there. The answer to the mystery of why the project was canceled came not from the laboratory, but from the battlefield, where the XB-41's close cousin finally took to the air. When the Americans launched the second version of the idea, the YB-40, based on the B-17, everything looked more promising. The machine was refined, the armor was strengthened, and more machine guns were installed. 25 copies in total. Pilots joked that these planes looked more like mobile fortresses than bombers. In May 1943, the YB-40s were sent to Europe. 14 sorties, 5 confirmed victories, and only 1 loss. It seemed the idea had finally worked, but behind the numbers lay a bitter truth. During attacks, the YB-40s did indeed cover the formation. Their volleys shot down enemy fighters, and the density of fire forced the enemy to be cautious. But when the mission was nearing its end and the bombers dropped their cargo, everything changed. Freed from thousands of kilograms of bombs, the regular B-17s became lighter and faster, while the heavy escort ships, laden with machine guns and armor, remained slow and overloaded. The return trip turned into a nightmare. The bombers raced home, and their defenders were left behind, unable to keep up. To maintain the formation, pilots had to reduce speed, stay under fire longer, and risk everything. Each sortie became a puzzle: fly fast and abandon the escort, or fly slow and perish together. The idea collapsed against simple physics. Engineers could install 30 machine guns, but they could not deceive aerodynamics. Every added turret meant extra weight. Every armor plate meant a loss of speed. The flying arsenal became a hostage to its own guns. Upon returning, the crews joked through their exhaustion. "We protected everyone but ourselves." The command quickly realized that continuing the tests was pointless. The project was shut down by the end of the summer. The remaining aircraft were used as transport or training planes. Another experiment was relegated to the archives of history, but, as is often the case, defeat became the first step toward a real solution. Thus ended the era of giants and began the age of speed. In American laboratories, work was already underway on a new philosophy of flight. Instead of clumsy defenders, light, swift, and long-range fighters were being created. Engineers finally found a way to bypass the main barrier: limited fuel supply, removable external tanks, new turbo-supercharged engines, and aerodynamic modifications. All this allowed the creation of machines that could escort bombers from takeoff to return. Thus emerged the P-38, P-47, and finally, the legendary P-51 Mustang. These aircraft became what the XB-41 desperately lacked: light, fast, and durable. They could fly alongside the fortresses for the entire distance, engage in combat, and return without refueling. Now, speed no longer had to be sacrificed for range. Technology had caught up with the dream. When the first squadrons of Mustangs took to the air, everything changed. German fighters, accustomed to easy prey, suddenly faced an opponent equal in agility and superior in endurance. Allied losses sharply decreased, and the bombing raids themselves began to reach farther and deeper. The era of experiments like the XB-41 ended, but it was precisely this era that paved the way. The failed projects did not disappear without a trace. Every unsuccessful sortie, every heavy machine unable to stay in the sky, brought closer the day when speed and range would finally unite. The XB-41 and YB-40 remain symbols of mistakes, but also symbols of the courage to attempt to find an answer when no answers existed. Sometimes, to make the sky safe, you have to build a plane that was never meant to fly.